Hello and welcome to the Brussels Signal studio here in the heart of the EU Quarter. We are privileged today to have Charlie Weimers come and join us. Thank you once again for being the first external guest in this studio. We're very happy to have you. Mr. Weimers is Vice Chair of the ECR group in the Parliament. He is from the Sweden Democrats Party. He is 40 years old, father of 4, and we're here today to talk about a couple of subjects. But before maybe we start our first one, could I perhaps just ask you to talk a bit about your political career? Where have you come from? I know that you used to be, well, for a long time, a Christian Democrat. How did you start out in politics, please?
Well, I was young and I was brought up in a social democratic society and I wanted to do something about it. I joined the center-right. I joined the Christian Democrats and became deeply involved in youth politics, a national chairman of the Christian Democratic Youth. I was working for the Minister of Social Affairs in the last center-right government under Prime Minister Reinfeldt. I became involved with European issues as early as 2004. I went to my first international conference in Kiev, Ukraine, where I found out that the Russians were using the energy weapon against Ukraine when Ukraine wanted to turn westwards. So if I knew it at the age of 20 plus something, I figured Angela Merkel would have known it as Chancellor of Germany a few years later, but obviously not. Yeah, I kept on working with the Christian Democrats for many years, including coming here as Chief of Staff for the Christian Democratic MEP at the time. But eventually I felt that the old center-right was unable to cope with the new developments in terms of migration, crime, new problems in Sweden. So I decided to join the Sweden Democrats, which I did in 2018.
2018, and you've been an MEP since 2019, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe you can talk about just 2 minutes on the Sweden Democrats and how they fit into the current coalition, the support agreement. How does that work, please?
Yeah. So the Sweden Democrats, they entered Parliament in 2010. And they became an officially conservative party as something like 10 years ago. That really made an impact on me because all the old center-right parties didn't want to touch, conservatism with a 10-foot pole. Liberalism was the order of the day. They invited Sir Roger Scruton, as the only Swedish party to their conferences. That said something about where they wanted to go, their trajectory. And that was to become the leading conservative force in Sweden, which the party is now. It's the number one party right of center in Sweden. Okay. It's not part of the government, right, but it's a supply and confidence agreement, okay, guaranteeing strong political impact for the Sweden Democrats on crime, on migration, also to a certain extent on EU issues, although I would have hoped for that it would be more. But nice. Maybe next time when we leave the government.
Okay, so when we leave the government,
lead.
I was going to say, I thought you broke a news story there for us.
No, of course. I mean, the goal of the Sweden Democrats is to lead a conservative government. But as a new party, it's a step-by-step process. So this time we're outside the government, but I think it's working fairly well. Big reforms are put in place. The effects to be seen a few years from now. I mean, we all wish it could go much, much faster, okay, with regards to all the shootings, the bombings, the gangs. We have huge problems in Sweden and we want to address them, but it's due process, so okay, everything needs to be assessed before it's being implemented.
So there is an agreement, a written agreement that dates back to the time you signed this support for, yeah. And are there ongoing negotiations? Is this agreement refined as you go along or not?
Yes, it's a 24/7 negotiation. almost. I mean, because everything that is in the agreement needs to be, as you say, refined and detailed, spelled out in terms of different directives to individuals who are to propose new legislation and so on and so forth. And it's about interpretations of the agreement and so on. But constant work, and of course this is a very good thing for our party. We have people inside the government negotiating, not from outside but inside, getting also an insider's perspective, which is preparing our party to take even more responsibility in 3 years after the next general election.
Okay, so how would you describe the difference between the kind of arrangement you've got and a traditional coalition? What's the difference?
Well, we have no ministers.
That's it, basically.
There was a heavy price for the others to pay in terms of policy concessions to us.
Right.
And I think the whole of Sweden, even many of our voters were surprised to learn how much influence we have on the government's policies. So.
Okay, and one of those topics is, of course, migration.
Indeed,
correct?
indeed.
Okay. Now, we're in late June here, and obviously migration, one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest subject at the moment under discussion here in Brussels in the EU institutions. We have a sort of compromise position in the Council. The Parliament seems to be incredibly divided on this issue. What is your assessment of where we stand now in the Parliament and maybe where we stand now in the Council, please?
Well, not long ago we had a vote in the European Parliament on the negotiation mandate for the trilogues, and if the majority would have had its way, it wouldn't even have been a roll call vote on this. It would just have been a rubber stamp process. But we, on the right, we were able to force that vote, at least showing the voters who's in favor of a migration pact version that is clearly in favor of mass migration to Europe. Now, the vote was held. The center left, they won, meaning that we're now in trilogues, and for how long these trilogues will be held, we don't know. Okay. But we sure know that Brussels would want everything to be a done deal before the next European elections, because they just want it out of the way. They want everybody to forget about migration when they go and cast their vote on election day, because they know it's a losing game for the center left. It's a very strong factor for our success.
As we've seen in member states over the course of recent elections. And what about the Council? What's your assessment of the Council position on this one?
Well, I mean, the Council position is not perfect. Me, myself, I would have preferred no mandatory points at all within European
the solidarity
policy.
Mechanism, you mean?
Exactly, because I do think that migration policy should be a national competence, fair and square. But if we look at the details of the Council position, you see that what they want is easier and faster expulsions. They want an end to the shuttle traffic on the Mediterranean, and they want processing of asylum applications outside the territory of the European Union with third countries. So many of the positions of the Council are something that we would agree with. The problem is that now there is going to be a negotiation with the European Parliament, which has a completely different position on this.
And do you have any expectations as to where this is going to end up? What do you think?
Well, it's going to be very interesting.
A compromise.
I'm fearing this compromise because, the Council position is basically as far as we can stretch ourselves in terms of conceding on this issue. But now the European Parliament will come and try to influence this. And if we look at the position of the European Parliament, it's, the first thing they did was to remove the fight against illegal migration, or irregular, as the EU prefers to rename it. But they removed the fight against illegal migration from the key paragraph of the regulation on asylum migration. That's an indication of their priorities.
Okay.
And they want unelected bureaucrats to decide migration volumes, to decide allocation of migrants to member states. And if they get through anything of that, it's a non-starter. And I don't think I only speak for myself here. I think countries such as Finland now with a center-right government, Spain after the elections in July will probably have a conservative government. So I think more and more then, if this goes through, will open up for a rejection. So the liberals or the center-left will have to decide, do they want the Migration Pact at all? If they do, they better be quite humble in those negotiations, I think.
So what you're suggesting is perhaps with the right-wing movement in certain member states, if the compromise is seen as not good enough, it could be rejected in council. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, eventually next year. Yeah.
Right. And what kind of position does that put Sweden in? I know you can only speak for your party, but I guess it puts Sweden in a difficult position as well.
Well, Sweden won't be the president of the European Council anymore, so it will have a much freer position than it had the last 6 months. And of course, we will have to estimate whether the negotiated compromise is in line with our four-party agreement called the TIDA agreement. If we conclude that this will eventually lead to more asylum migration to Sweden, then I honestly don't see any alternative than saying no for Sweden.
Right, okay. So it's fair to say then that as far as the council position stands today, you say you can accept it, but you're afraid that the parliament's going to drag it in another direction.
Yes.
Is that fair? Okay. Now let's go on then to talk about migration in general. Where do you stand? I know that you've been quoted as being in favour, for example, of the Australian model and to support a wall between Greece and Turkey. Is that correct? And you've talked about processing claims, asylum seekers in non-EU countries. Perhaps we could start on the Australian model. What does that mean for you?
For me, it means that if you try to enter European territory illegally, you have forfeited your right to apply for asylum. Simple as that.
Right.
That's something that made the deaths at sea go down to zero outside the coast of Australia.
Right.
It's the only proven way to stop these deadly boats coming across the Mediterranean. So I would say that as long, and I think we will continue to have these disparities in terms of income between Africa and Europe, as long as we have these big disparities,
there's going to be a draw.
There will be very strong pull factors, and even more so if we allow mass migration to continue, because one of the strongest pull factors is diasporas in Europe.
Okay.
So for me, the Australian model needs to be implemented, and I think it will be eventually, because if you look at the Migration Pact, if you look at the Council proposal, they say that 30,000 migrants should be relocated annually, and that every country can buy its way out of that. Well, since Giorgia Meloni took office in Rome, 100,000 migrants have come to Italy alone.
Right.
So we're talking about figures that are too big for Europe to handle.
Okay.
And if we look at projections, demographic projections from the United Nations, for instance, we see that within this century, the population of Africa will increase from 1.4 billion to 4 billion. I mean, compared with 500 million citizens of the European Union. So I mean, the migratory pressure will keep on increasing, and eventually, I think that frontier states, when they realize that the Migration Pact is not fit for purpose, they will have a decision to make. Either they do as 2015, just waving migrants through to destination countries in Northern Europe, or they push back like the Australians did.
Right.
And then it would be ultra vires, because what they would see is that Northern European states would impose internal border controls, and that basically the internal border or the external border, if Italy, Spain, and it would be at the south of Austria. It would be so no one waved through could enter the rest of Europe, and then the Australian model would
have to be implemented.
A necessity, really.
So, right, you mentioned two things there, the pushbacks and then ensuring legally that anyone who tries to come does not have a chance of staying here, right? Are those two different things? Because, right, so you're suggesting that anyone who tries to come has no chance, and this would therefore discourage them from coming in the first place.
Yes.
Now, when you say pushbacks, what do you mean?
I mean that boats entering European waters will be stopped before they enter the shore, basically, before anyone can set their foot on European territory. I mean that Europe will have to look at new options like the British are doing with Rwanda, Denmark as well, because help on the spot, help in the near region, that is the only way to avoid big waves of economic migrants in the future.
You mean improving the economic situation in the countries of origin?
Yeah, I mean, opening up for trade opportunities, but also, I mean, for instance, during the war in Iraq, Syria, I went to IDP camps, and they were telling me about the lack of education material for the young, medicines, doctors, and so on and so forth. And Europe is spending so much money on each asylum seeker entering European territory instead of listening to the UNHCR, who are really desperately begging for more funding to cover those camps in the near region of a conflict. So we need to be much more rational when we spend money on helping real refugees, and we must stop economic migration to Europe.
Okay.
Those two things on the same time. And I think a major role would be played by refuge opportunities in third countries, Rwanda or any other country.
Where they're processed, essentially. But I just
and refuge as well.
Right.
Because then you remove any incentive to economic migration.
I'm just wondering, though, if when you say pushbacks, I mean, there have been talks of sort of some kind of naval blockade. Is this the kind of direction we're headed in?
I think we will be when frontier states realize that Brussels won't help them. They will impose this.
Right.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if that's logistically possible. How many naval vessels would you need to blockade the Libyan coast? I mean, that sounds like a pretty major naval operation. I mean,
it will be a major operation, but I mean the problems with mass migration are major as well. So I think quite a few countries would be ready to spend vast resources on securing their borders, and I think we're moving towards financial support eventually from the EU to secure the external border, because I think people realize that if we can't secure the external border, there will be these permanent internal border controls. And I think that is worse for Brussels, really, because that takes away the idea of free movement within the European Union.
Right,
and that's a major foundation of the idea of an integrated Europe.
In fact, Schengen is only working, sort of half working at the moment already, in fact, isn't it? Lots of countries do bring Schengen down quite often. On migration in Sweden, what's the situation today? I mean, is there been a big increase in arrivals, for example?
No, I mean, what we see now is the sort of effects of previous migration waves, chain migration, family reunification, and this is something that we will continue to live with as long as we don't make the rules stricter in terms of providing welfare and other things that serve as pull factors for migration to Sweden. But the big discussion in Sweden right now is not migration, but it is the consequences of migration in terms of crime, which is becoming more and more lethal. We have one shooting a day on average, and the shootings are becoming more and more reckless. We had a mass shooting in a Galleria shopping mall the other week, and you see more and more so-called civilian casualties due to these gang wars that are going on. The gang wars being a very clear consequence of mass migration. And people, of course, they react when gangs have the audacity to impose checkpoints to their areas outside Gothenburg, for instance. And so this is number one point on the agenda, not only for the government, but for the people as well.
Okay, I want to move on because there's another issue, the bigger issue, and that is the future of the European Union that I'd like to touch on with you. The Sweden Democrats Eurosceptic Party, I know that you've talked about referendum locks and power, limiting the transfer of power from member states to Brussels. I mean, if you look at the history of the European Union, the traffic is one way, isn't it, really? Let's face it.
Ever closer union, right?
Ever closer union. I mean, how realistic is it to say, stop? I mean, I guess what you want is stop, but do you want to turn back the clock as well?
Look, the Swedish population right now is strongly in favor of continued EU membership. And I think much will depend on how successful Brexit is. And people are very quick to judge there. I would say that it will take another 10 years before we know whether Brexit was a success or not. And they've just started, removing EU legislation, red tape, and so on. These things take time. And I think, so we're living in that reality. And me, myself, I ask myself, what can I do to improve democracy in Sweden, to try to stop power grabs by Brussels? And there, I think a referendum lock would be a very good idea, providing the opportunity for Swedish voters to go and cast their vote against major power transfers. It could be eventually on the Migration Pact. It could be on treaty change, removing, as Commissioner Gentiloni wants, natural vetoes on fiscal policy. That I think would suit very well for a referendum lock, or another Corona fund, increasing debt and putting future generations in debt for decades to come. Those things. But I realize that the other parties, they will try to keep their distance to this idea for as long as they can. The only way for us to actually be able to get it through is to win elections, to win EU elections, like UKIP and the Brexit Party did at the time, which forced then the Tories to...
Of course, they were in favour of leaving entirely, but what you're talking about is just stopping further transfers.
Yeah, and we know that Swedes are against these further transfers.
Okay. But what I'm pushing for is there a desire, in your opinion, among the Swedes to turn back the clock to a time when the European Union was a single market without any of the political trappings, or is that just not feasible?
I mean, to a large extent, the answer is yes. I do think that voters think that when we can agree on joint foreign policy proposals, I mean, in terms of Ukraine and other things, I think the voters are in favor. Although I am quite convinced that any thought of a European army, which is proposed by the EU Parliament, that is shunned by the voters. Personally, I think it's a much better idea to join the intergovernmental NATO than to cede any powers on defense to a supranational European Union. But yeah, I mean, the single market is the main argument for Sweden being in the European Union. And of course, now when we see that the EU is taking on debt, that it's trying to impose picking winners and losers among companies, using a very classically corporatist fashion of dealing with the market, working together with vested interests, and
as opposed to a free market,
as opposed to institutional competition, as opposed to removing red tape so that startups, innovative companies can blossom. I think when that plays out, more voters will turn to alternatives away from those who say that everything is hanky-dory with the European Union.
So, but no chance that Sweden will leave the European Union in the near future?
Not in the near future, no. I don't see that happening.
Okay. Finally, your predictions for the 2024 elections, what's going to happen? How will that affect the Parliament, for example, do you think?
Well, I think EPP, ECR governments are becoming more and more widespread throughout Europe now. Sweden, Finland, maybe Spain. More and more countries are doing this, and I think that will spill over to the European Parliament. And I think that my group, the Conservative group, will increase. You have it in Italy as well, obviously, the Meloni government. And the EPP realized that in order not to having to pander to the Greens and the progressives, they will have to work with us. But of course, we will remind voters that this is exactly what they did the last 5 years. The Green Deal and the cost of living will be a major issue in the next election, and you see the EPP is turning now on that. Well, it's because they've probably done their polling, and they know that the voters hate it. Well, we voted against it from day one, and we will remind voters who did that and who's to rely on when it comes to supporting the little guy who has a job, who has to take the car to work and so on, has a family to provide for and heating and so on and so forth.
So a right-wing, centre-right majority in the Parliament?
Yeah, I think we're close to that. It won't be worse than what we have now, which is probably the most progressive European Parliament the world has ever seen.
Right. And then a knock-on effect for the European Commission when the next...
Hopefully, but one has to be aware of that the European Commission is serving the EU and not the member states that nominated the commissioners. They are basically swearing a European oath to serve the interest of an ever closer union. So sure, the Commission could become better, but I never expect the Commission to be an ally of us who want a slimmer, more effective European Union. We, as parliamentarians, will have to push that over and over again.
Mr. Weimers, Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks so much.